Right. Hello, David. I guess we could pretend that we're just saying hello to each other when actually we've been talking for 10 minutes. I'm Natasha, and we're here today to talk about the new normal, autistic musings on the threat of a broken society, which is a new book by David Gray-Hammond. David's also released a poetry book at the same time, so we'll be talking a little bit about the connection between those. I am somebody who follows David's work and likes having conversations, so I asked him if he wanted to do this. So we worked on the idea together, and I am a pale-skinned white woman. Well, no, I'm not really a woman. I'm non-binary, but I got used to saying I'm a woman because I can't deal with explaining non-binary to people all the time. So I have kind of so-called mousy brown hair that's off my face and in a bit of a quiff, and I'm wearing a cream, like traditional fisherman's jumper, and I'm in an attic room with a chair and some coats hanging behind me, and I'm not used to doing these descriptions, so I might miss some information out. David, do you want to do your introduction and then let me know if there's anything else I need to say?
So I am David Gray-Hammond. I'm a white person of Mediterranean descent. I have a shaved head, a beard, thick rimmed glasses, a lip piercing and a ear piercing. I am sat in a room with blue walls, blue curtains, and next to a bookcase covered in books. And yeah, that's about it really.
Yeah, so I don't have glasses on and I haven't got any jewelry on particularly. And the room I'm in is white with a grey thing, grey carpet. I am autistic and I'm also neurodivergent. I have attention differences and I have a dyslexic mind, and I have experienced periods of great mental and emotional distress. And I come from some folks that are survivors of psychiatric abuse, amongst other things. And yeah, that's kind of like my neurodivergent scene. I'm also getting used to talking about this. I'm a survivor of childhood abuse or familial abuse, as well as general neurodivergent abuse. So that's my kind of history and what I bring to today. David, do you want to just introduce yourself as the author and what you
Yeah, so I'm David Gray-Hammond. I wrote the book, The New Normal Autistic Musings on the Threat of a Broken Society. I'm autistic, attention differences. I have schizophrenia, and I mean, I've done a lot of stuff. I sort of, started out as an independent consultant in a voluntary capacity, working for a branch of the charity Mind, representing the treatment rights of neurodivergent drug users, working with clinical commissioning groups in drug-related death groups. Harm reduction, that sort of thing. I've done drug market profiles in my home city of Brighton, analysing the drug markets for Brighton. I have been writing on a blog since about the beginning of 2018, and that's sort of how we got to this point today. That's where it all started, really. I'm the former Chief Operating Officer of Neuroplastic. I am a regular educator, learner at Academy, and I also host their podcast. I am one of the co-authors of the Creating Autistic Suffering series with Tanya Adkin. I'm also co-author of the Neuroqueer series with Katie Monday, and yeah, that's probably gives you a good idea of who I am. You
Yeah,
know, I do, you know, I also run my own business, DGH Neurodivergent Consultancy.
great. I picked up on having schizophrenia because I wanted to ask you what that means to you, um, and then relate that to essays in the book that talk about mental health as part of neurodivergence. So, could you tell us what having schizophrenia means to you?
So for me, it's complicated actually, because when I have had psychotic episodes, I have often described myself as being unwell, and I'm not convinced that's inaccurate, because psychotic episodes are terrifying. They're not good for your well-being. That said, being schizophrenic in itself, I view as a form of acquired neurodivergence. You know, I experienced excessive trauma throughout my life, and it seems almost a logical inevitability that something like this would arise within me. Um, you know, I accept that I have a brain. I already had a brain that functioned differently to everyone else's.
Mm.
And this is, you know, just another way that it functions differently. For me, it largely looks like, you know, I hear voices, and you know, I might have the occasional visual hallucination. I do take medication for it. I have a back and forth relationship with my medication, because medication for schizophrenia is not pleasant. But it does seem to reduce the frequency with which I have episodes. And yeah, I guess mainly I've come to peace with the fact that it's there. I don't necessarily like the fact that I can, you know, slip into these alternate realities that my brain comes up with. But I strongly feel that it needs to be recognized as a form of neurodivergence, because so often we tell people with mental health issues that they are ill, they are broken, they need fixing. And I don't think that actually helps their well-being. I think what we're doing when we say those things is we are putting the responsibility onto the person, and we're not calling out the structures in society around them that led to those mental health and well-being issues.
Yeah. So I think that kind of nicely takes us to the topic of the book, which is exactly about this. It's not broken individuals, but broken. The thing that we live in is broken. The systems and structures that we live in are broken. Yeah, in a sense, my route into neurodivergence was through mental health. I used to work in the voluntary sector many years ago, and when the Hearing Voices Network was beginning about 25 years ago, not beginning, but when it was in its, you know, it's in a different sort of stage of history. And that's when I was sort of first introduced to these ideas about social models of disability and the idea of mental illness as trauma responses. So it's been really good to sort of see how that has grown, and then kind of see how it crosses over, because my understanding was that neurodivergence has always included that understanding, but it tends, maybe whilst we're trying to sort of promote the idea that of a sort of strengths-based approach to neuro differences, that we're kind of leaving out the acquired neurodivergence, or I don't know, it sometimes feels like trying to keep ourselves away from it, or I don't know. So that, that's the thing that I think goes on, and that you talk a bit about in the essays in the book. I need to talk about. I'm way more nervous than I thought I was going to be. So this is fun. I'm going to use my script about. So, in terms of my experience of the book, like I sometimes feel like some stuff is like fresh air. It kind of like makes me feel nourished, and it's almost like, because I don't read with I words. My friend recorded it for me, and so it's almost like whenever I need some scaffolding for my own advocacy, I can listen to this. It's like this amazing like source of like neurodivergent pride, and I personally find it really liberating. It's also theoretical, which I love, like, because it helps me understand how things work. But I like the self-reflective parts as well, the way that you then also talk about the essay and where it came from and how you feel about it. So I'm interested in, how did you come to make the book? So you said there was blogging happening, so it's been a sort of extension of that. But why did you get to the moment of like, oh, I think I'll make a book?
So I started blogging sort of back end of 2017, beginning of 2018. And since then, I mean, I've probably written a couple of hundred different blog pieces on my website. And when I first started, I wasn't really doing it with the intention of anyone reading it. It was more just like a cathartic exercise for myself.
Yeah.
But then people started finding my writing, and in particular, a very helpful person called Emma Dalmain came across my writing and invited me to their Facebook group. And at this point, it was like walking in, and I was like, there is an entire community of us, and I did not know that this was here. Um, um, and that was a really important moment, because suddenly people in the autistic community were aware of my writing. And I was like, okay, I feel like I have a bit of a responsibility now to make sure that I am doing this justice. So I started just absorbing information. I was spending time in like various Facebook groups and reading blogs, reading research, just absorbing all the information I could. And I was I was using my blog, the Emergent Divergence blog, to sort of, it was how I was processing that information. So as I learned something, I would write about it. And I often say I don't know my opinion on something until I've written it. So it was helping me sort of put everything into context of my own life, other people's lives, and gain a better understanding. And over the years, as I said, I was accumulating a lot of these blog posts, and shortly before I sort of put the book together, I hit about 50,000 views on my blog. So I was like, okay, so a lot of people have been reading this now. So I'd always wanted to write a book, but I didn't think I was able to do it. I didn't think I'd have the patience to sit and write a whole book. But as it was, I had this idea, and I looked and I was like, some of these blog posts, I'm really proud of them, but they've not necessarily been the most popular posts. And I suspect it was because, you know, in the blog format, people don't often go out there for these very theoretical sort of approaches. So what I did was I sort of thought of this theme of looking at society and how society as a structure was sort of broken by design. And I took blog posts off of my website and I started rewriting them. And then I started, as I was rewriting them, I was collating them all into one document. And before I realized what I'd done, I written a whole book. So as you've probably seen in the self-reflection, I talk about the fact that some of the essays, you know, I had previously written and then I'd rewritten.
Yeah.
Um, and But that the book itself is actually based on the original essays off of my Emergent Divergence blog. But what I did was just rework them, rewrite them, because some of them are years old. So I've learned a lot more since then. So I was able to go back and sort of invigorate new life into them. You know, incorporate the new knowledge I've learned in the years since writing some of them. And I chose the topic of looking at a broken society because when I look around at all the autistic people in my life, the one thing that we all have in common, despite being individuals, one thing we really have in common, and I think it's one of the, we don't talk about it necessarily, but really one of the main shared experiences of being autistic, I think, is the fact that society is not nice to us. You know, we talk about, oh, you know, with autistic living in a neurotypical society. What we don't talk about is the fact that that society was designed to keep us out on purpose because we don't fit these neuronormative ideas. Um, you know, when you look at the history of how, especially, you know, European culture and Eurocentric culture has developed, people who are different from what was considered normal in inverted commas
Yeah.
have been boxed out on purpose. And I wanted to highlight that. And it got me thinking, you know, how does not just how does this affect our well-being, but how does this affect our sense of self, our sense of identity? How does this affect autistic culture? Because whether people like to admit it or not, there is such a thing as autistic culture.
Yeah, sure. Yeah. Yeah. And um, you know, my experience, because I get to autistic identity at the age of, I think, 43. So the issues around me up until that point had been issues of self-identity, because basically, you know, from my understanding, you construct yourself through your interactions with the world. So essentially, if your interactions are never quite being received or understood, how do you construct yourself? So the whole thing is a sort of, you know, like a terrible instability. And my understanding of it had been that, like, it's not a broken, like, it's not as if the system gets together and thinks to itself, let's fuck those people over. It's more that, you know, like in terms of system theory, that the purpose of the relationships and the purpose of the system necessarily creates the problem. Because I think when we talk about, oh, it's this, you know, system problem, people think of like people in a room planning to make life difficult for autistic people, but it's like a negligence rather than a conspiracy. Do you know what I mean? And that's helped me to sort of make more sense to other people when I talk about it in those terms. And I think that's the other thing that's useful about your book, that I almost feel like I'm getting language that I can then use to tell other people. So it helps me build understanding in my community. Because I think one of the difficult things about autistic experience is not having a language to access your culture. So there is an autistic culture, but you can't be in it because you're used to having to be in somebody else's, and you know, this kind of thing. So
And you're absolutely right. It's not a question of people sat down in like a little war room and were like, right, how do we screw over the autistic people? You know, I talk about this in the book, you know, that we live in a capitalist society which is profit driven. So of course they're going to want people who create the profit they're after. Autistic people need accommodations to fulfill a profit-driven rule, and if that's perceived to reduce profits, then of course the system that we exist in is going to be discriminatory against us, because if the goal of the system is to create profit and we're actually costing money, then we're going to be perceived differently by that system and treated differently by that system. But fundamentally, I wanted the book to be somewhat of a call to arms that we can be aware of our place in the current system, and we have a choice, really. We can either accept it and carry on living in that system, or we can, as Nick Walker puts it, throw away the master's tools, dismantle the system to the best of our ability, and rebuild it into something that works for everyone.
Well, this was another thing that interests me about getting more involved in sort of autistic pride, because that, I'm pretty sure that quote is from Audre Lorde. I think it's Audre Lorde. So making the connection between other movements of liberation has been an important thing for me. And I guess I wanted to ask about that sometimes when I kind of go, it's not us, the system's broken, that there's a sense of like, how's that helpful? So how do you, because I personally find it very stimulating and as like you described, a call to arms to go, it's not us, it's the system. So have you come across that problem of people kind of going, I don't want to know that like in a sense, it's easier for them to go, no, I'm the broken one. This happens a lot, I think, in mental illness. People are more comfortable with, no, I've got the disease, than they are with, no, I was driven mad by what happened to me. Do you have anything to say on that? Like, how does a broken society liberate us?
The idea that I think the main liberating factor in understanding that society is the thing that's broken and not the individual is that it takes that sense of responsibility off of us to do something about. Let me try coming at this from a different angle. We are neurodivergent. Nothing we can do is going to make us not neurodivergent. That's what being neurodivergent is. We are neurodivergent, and we will be neurodivergent until we're gone. Society doesn't have to stay the same. So we can either think that our neurodivergence is this big problem in us that we can't do anything about, or we can understand that society is the problem, and realize that if we want to, if we have the capacity to, and whatever that capacity looks like is valid, but if we want to and have the capacity to, we can do something about society. And that really liberates me.
Yeah, me too. And I've during sort of autistic burnout, I've had times of great hopelessness and despair, which I'm deliberately avoiding calling depression, because I think depression's a political problem, because it's an individualized illness. It's not a description of the experience anymore, because the language has changed. And I remember having like this idea of like me being frontline. Like, if we're here to sort of help change the world, it's like, well, at the minute, the only world is me. So my responsibility today is to get this human body through the day without it getting to the point where it thinks it needs to be removed from the earth, or, like, so that the world sort of shrinks. But I think the culture we live in tends to view us as not included in the world that needs changing, if you see what I mean. We tend to see it as like, oh, if I'm going to go and change the world, that happens outside of me. It's not to do with me. Does that make sense? Have you had experience of your world being just you?
I think it kind of leads neatly into this idea of otherness. So,
yeah,
society whether it's done it intentionally or not, has created this sense of otherness around neurodivergence. We are other to the mainstream. And I think one of the things that can really make us feel a great deal of despair is, okay, you know, I feel very liberated that society's broken, but how do I fix it from the outside? We're not actually on the outside of the system. If we were, the system probably wouldn't be doing the harm it's doing to us. The reason the system is doing the harm it's doing to us is because we are very much in the system. You know, we exist among the structures of society. No matter how much we try to distance ourselves from it, we live in civilizations, we live in various cultures around the world. We are all part of that culture's structures and systems. And so we have been othered, and yeah, you know, we can feel a great deal of despair about that. But it's important to recognize that we are actually still part of that overall culture, and we can work from the inside to change, you know, to change those structures.
Makes me think about you talk, I think, your explanations of ableism and how ableism functions and the connection between racism, ableism, sexism. I wondered, like, what was your route to, was there a time where you had more internalized ableism, and what was your route to sort of learning what you've learned and that you share in the book on that?
To be completely honest, I used to have a great deal of internalized ableism. There was a time if people search hard enough on the internet, they will find an article I wrote for a particular outlet that I refuse to write for anymore, where I talked about the fact that I would take a cure if it was offered to me. I've been writing longer than I've been in the autistic community, and as such, it's only been in recent years that I've really done the work to start dismantling that internalized ableism. And like anyone else, I still have a great deal of internalized ableism inside me. Just like, I'm a white person. I benefit from white supremacy. We all have sort of these bigoted views conditioned into us to an extent, whether we care to admit it or not. And it's been really tricky trying to search out, especially the ableism, and try and catch it so I can go, right, why do I think this? Because I can extend compassion to literally everyone else, but I'm still using this very ableist view on myself.
Yeah, yeah.
And it's interesting trying to work out where it comes from.
And that's a process that you seem to do in your writing, right? That's what you sort of testify, that its purpose is really.
Yeah. And that book really, The New Normal really served a good purpose for me in helping me further dismantle some ideas that I had about myself. It really helped me come to terms, especially with my acquired neurodivergence, the schizophrenia in that. It really helped me work through that, because I was actually, I started hearing voices when I was 18. I'm 32 now, and I only got my diagnosis this year. So, it's been 14 years of psychosis without a diagnosis. So I've been coming to terms with various forms of ableism that I have in my life, and writing that book helped me pick it apart. And then once I picked it apart, I was able to take all the different parts and kind of lay it out for everyone to see and go, well, I think this is a problem we all have. And I was able to take my experience and perhaps try and create a map that others can use.
Yeah. Well, I feel like that happened in the book for me. So thank you. I wanted to make the connection. We were talking about sort of theoretical and reflective writing, because there's obviously different sorts of writing. And I think, yeah, I was interested in, because I really like theoretical, but because I pass as a woman, I'm not allowed to be theoretical. Don't know if you knew that, David, but it's a gendered activity. So I'm allowed to be poetic. So that's the rules of the genders as I've experienced them. So you wrote a poetry book as well. So I wondered what your experience is with those dichotomies of theoretical, poetic, and how you've used that.
I'm very much of the opinion that theory, and this might sound quite extreme to some people, theory is an art form.
Hallelujah.
It requires creativity. People don't just it's not like you've just got a machine putting together theories. Like, you need to have that creative mind in order to understand theory and build on theory and create new theory. And for me, releasing the poetry book around the same time as the essay anthology, a lot of it was I wanted to prove that I'm not a one-trick pony, as they would say. You know, I love writing poetry. I will say, when I write poetry, and this is probably one of my more annoying habits if you're a die-hard poetry snob, I refuse to follow any particular poetic rules.
Me too. I don't rhyme.
Yeah, I don't rhyme. I don't use things like iambic pentameter, not on purpose anyway. You know, I mean, I've got A levels in English literature and all sorts, but I refuse to write to poetic, because it's art, so it should be an expression of me, and me is kind of chaotic, honestly. So I wanted to show that I released them sort of together because they're both sort of talking about the same thing.
Yeah.
But one is theoretical, the other one is typically artistic. But I wanted people to be able to look at them together and go, both of these things are just as valid as each other. Because so often, especially when it comes to art, people are like, oh, we need to throw all the funding into the sciences, into research and development. But actually, we can learn just as much from creative endeavors as we do from the very strict academic research, development, theory. You know, not everyone is going to want to access academia. Academia is famously inaccessible to just about everyone, including the people who work in it. But art is for everyone. It's for everyone, you know, and I just wanted to kind of prove a point. So I released the two together, and yeah, that's
What's the name of the poetry book?
the poetry book is called Existence, and it's a lot more personal than the essay anthology, because a lot of it is based on my experience of society and my experience of being neurodivergent.
That's an interesting clarification, though, because, like, how is theory? Because to me, theory is personal. Like, so I listen to a theoretical model, or I listen to a theoretical description of how something works in the world. I check whether it matches my experience of the world, and then I adopt it. So it's very personal to me, theory. It's not, but it's communal, because essentially you read other people's ideas and then you integrate them into your own. But so how is it less personal to you?
Well, yeah, this is a tricky question, because the truth is neither of them are less personal to me, but the poetry collection itself is much more overtly personal to me. Like, if you imagine that the essay anthology, it's like I took the part of my mind that 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 processes theory and sees whether it matches up with my experience and put that out there.
Yeah.
Then the poetry collection is like I took a piece of my soul or whatever you want to call it and put that out there. So they're both personal to me, but they're from different parts of myself.
Yeah. Yeah. That's really interesting to make that distinction, because I often get people tell me my work website, somebody read it and told me, well, it's very personal. And I was like, what's that mean? That's one of those moments where I need like a neurotypical translator.
Yeah, and I think it's important to note this is part of neurodivergent culture. We
Yes.
do things personally.
Yeah, exactly. Everything's
Like, like we are not people who can just be like arbitrary and detached.
yeah.
You know, like this idea that we all lack empathy and have no emotions. You've only got to read the stuff that we write, look at things we say, really anything that we do to realize that actually we are some of the most emotional and in touch with other people and ourselves humans on the planet. Because I don't know. I mean, I've seen sort of business things and that are very impersonal. They have no appeal to me.
No. No, and I think impersonal somehow the wrong, like, it to me it's more I was listening to Harry, don't know, Harry Thompson, talk about pervasive demand for autonomy, or PDA, and he was talking about the sacricity of living, like how PDAers seem to live with a sort of like seriousness, or like the significance of what they do is really high. And I totally relate to this. So I think pervasive, I'm like, yeah, really into autonomy. So it has that sense of like, if I'm going to do this, I'm going to do it with all meaning. Like I can't do it with like surface commitment, or just, do you know what I mean?
Yeah, and I think kind of what it brings to mind for me is, and for want of a better word, because I don't really want to tie it in with religion, but I think for neurodivergent people on the whole, we're very aware of like the sanctity of life.
Yeah, yeah, that's
Um,
yeah,
and we, my mother's a priest, for example. She's a priest in the Church of England. And in the Church of England, they have what they call the sacraments, which is like the bread, the wine, baptism, things like that. So they're sort of holy rites.
yeah,
Um, I don't, I mean, I don't really subscribe to any particular religion. I'm not particularly sure if I believe in anything or if I do what it is.
yeah,
But I do see the way that we express ourselves as a form of sacrament, because we are sharing literally the most personal thing we can
mm,
with the world.
mm,
And if anything in this world is even close to being holy, I think it's the act of sharing yourself.
yeah,
And that's why I believe, that, and that is why I wanted to have the essay anthology and the poetry collection come out close together,
yeah.
because I couldn't share my whole self without both of those parts.
That's yeah. This makes a lot of sense. I wanted to ask if about your experiences of so-called imposter syndrome, which I'm working on the idea that people who don't experience imposter syndrome are the ones that are actually sort of disordered, because essentially imposter syndrome is the ability to perceive the way that a space is modulated by power. So it's the sensitivity to the fact that people are going to restrict your power or your access to something. So thinking about like when you sort of entered the institution of being a writer or an author or a poet, did you find that easy to get into those places, or did you find it? I'm curious about how your identity as a man affected it, and whether you felt you had the legitimacy to say something.
I've long suspected I have some privilege I've been sort of unaware of, like, because I am a white cisgendered male. Yes, I'm autistic, and yes, I'm queer, but being a white cisgendered male does give you a fair bit of privilege in life. And I haven't had too many serious issues with people coming up and being like, why have you said this? Like, this is harmful or this is wrong. Not many people have argued with me. That's not to say no one has. And I have had issues in the past with people intentionally misunderstanding my words. But I was lucky that it felt quite easy to start with the blogging, because at first no one was reading it. And then the people who were reading it just seemed to love what I was saying. I suspect perhaps it could have been more difficult if I hadn't have been a white cisgendered male. I to an extent, if you take my queerness out of the equation, which I know you can't really do, but for hypothetical reasons, for all intents and purposes, I am the stereotype of an autistic person. I'm relatively clever. I'm white. I'm socially awkward. I'm male. People used to call me Sheldon, as in Sheldon Cooper from The Big Bang Theory.
Yeah.
And back then, I thought it was really funny. And it was only as I came to understand more about my autistic self, I was like, actually, that really was not very funny. But it's. I certainly have had privilege in where I am. I've had privilege throughout my life, and it's really the only reason that I am able to be here and be a published author.
I think that's really important to talk about, because I sometimes talk with friends about like how our I don't know. No, I think I can say this. To understand that the fact that we're alive and neither heavily medicated in a mental health system and not physically harmed is very much to do with our class privilege, because our experience of interpersonal abuse, and we're protected from a certain level of violence because of our class. And to understand that you are not where somebody else is only because of the money and the education seems an important thing to acknowledge, to sort of really feel how close you came. Do you know what I mean? Like how precarious things are. I think.
See, I didn't have the privilege of money, unfortunately. I grew up below the poverty line. I have struggled from. I mean, I was an addict for the best part of a decade. In active addiction. We don't tend to have plenty of money when we're in active addiction. I have been in a psych ward twice, and that was not a pleasant experience. I've had things that have not been great in life, but it doesn't detract from the fact that my experiences of those not great things could have been a lot worse if I didn't have the privileges that I do have.
Yeah, and it's I think, understanding that, I don't know, brings a certain complexity. It helps me take seriously the precariousness, which seems important. No, it's really. I'm looking at notes here to relate this to. So we're going to come to the end of the interview, and I just wanted to pick up one of the topics that comes up at various points in the essays, which I struggle to pronounce, rhetoricity. And somehow the idea is around autistics lacking rhetoricity. Is that, could you explain a bit about that?
So, I mean, I was very much inspired by Remy Yergo's book, Authoring Autism, on this front, which is a book that its subtitle is literally on rhetoric and neurological queerness. And there's this idea in the book that autistic people are either too autistic to be part of the conversation or not autistic enough. And it creates this, what Yergo refers to as demi-rhetoricity, where we are both autistic and not the right sort of autistic, and therefore doesn't matter what we do, we can't inform our own narratives. And I really wanted to highlight that in this book because I think it's almost wielded as a weapon in society for when minority groups try to speak out against a system that is oppressing them. That system will then come back with, well, your voice doesn't count because of this reason, and your voice doesn't count because of that reason.
Yeah.
And in the case of autistic people, we will use the example of, something that people in the autistic community talk about a lot is the martyr parents, in inverted commas. Now, if you approach someone who falls into this particular stereotype and say, well, actually, I don't think what you're saying about your autistic child is okay, they'll come back, well, you're not really autistic. You're not the same sort of autistic person as my child, and it's very invalidating because, okay, we all have different experiences of our neurodivergence. We all do, because we're humans, we are all individual, and we can't even prove that we will have the same experience of being autistic. The only way we kind of know we do is through observable behaviors and what we say out loud.
Yeah.
We can't go into someone else's head and be like, oh yeah, this is very me. But in the same sense, you take, for example, the non-speaking community, and because they can't verbally communicate what they want to say, people then invalidate them and basically say they're too autistic for their opinions to count, or they've got the wrong views on, in fact, this is one of my pet peeves actually, is that a lot of non-speaking people get excluded from the autistic community for using the wrong language which we don't give them the opportunity to access. And I think it all comes down to this idea of demi-rhetoricity. You're either too autistic or not autistic enough. And it even happens within the autistic community. And we need to just accept that being autistic is being autistic. It's not good, it's not bad, it just is. There isn't more autistic or less autistic. Yeah, we can have various things going on around being autistic that can make it a more complex situation. But autistic people themselves are just autistic, and all of our voices are valid. And not everyone's going to have a really helpful voice. There will, like any group, there will be autistic people who have very harmful views, because once again, we're human beings, and there are human beings out there who have some really harmful opinions and views. But we should at least start from a place of assuming that everyone has something to contribute to the conversation.
Yeah. That sounds like a good place to close.
Doesn't it?
So yeah, I'm happy. Yeah, it's really good to experience autistic culture and those autistic voices getting to the moment in history where there's books and there's films, and do you know what I mean? Like, yeah, it's a good time for that. Thank you thank you for the conversation today, and thank you for the book. And is there anything else you want to finish up with?
No, I think we've had a pretty good conversation. Obviously, people can check out my blog where a lot of the stuff started from. That's emergentdivergence.com, and it's also on Facebook. And you know, if they really want to, they can check out my business page as well, which is DGH Neurodivergent Consultancy. But yeah, thanks for having me come and talk your ear off.
That was no, yeah, I'm in to get my ears talked off. I think clearly your consultancy and stuff is based around this deep understanding of how things are happening and not happening. So I'm glad that is there to sort of integrate the knowledge into other parts of the culture and the community. It's really cool. Thank you, David.
Thank you. Bye.